Sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected encounters. In a world where first impressions often deceive and assumptions run wild, one sergeant's casual joke about military hierarchy was about to collide with a truth that would shake his very foundation. What happens when someone you underestimate turns out to hold power beyond your wildest imagination? This is the story of how a simple conversation at a coffee shop became a lesson in respect, humility, and the dangerous game of judging others by their appearance. Some encounters change everything in a matter of seconds. This is one of those stories. Sergeant Marcus Thompson had always believed that respect was earned through rank, and his 3 stripes on his sleeve were proof enough of his authority. At 28, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had climbed the military ladder through sheer determination and grit. His uniform was always pressed to perfection, his boots polished until they gleamed like mirrors, and his posture spoke of a man who demanded attention wherever he went. It was a typical Tuesday morning when Marcus decided to grab coffee at the small cafe near the base. The place was nothing fancy, just wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee that attracted both military personnel and civilians from the surrounding area. Marcus had been coming here for months, enjoying the way conversations would quiet when he entered, how younger soldiers would nod respectfully in his direction, and how the barista always served him first, regardless of who was waiting in line. On this particular morning, the cafe was busier than usual. Marcus stood in line behind a woman who appeared to be in her late 40s. She was dressed simply in jeans and a plain gray sweater, her graying hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested military background. She looked like any other civilian, perhaps a local teacher or office worker grabbing coffee before starting her day. Marcus barely glanced at her as he checked his phone, scrolling through messages from his squad. The woman ahead of him was taking her time deciding what to order, which began to irritate Marcus. He had a schedule to keep, and waiting behind someone who couldn't make a simple decision about coffee seemed beneath his time and status. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, making his impatience obvious through exaggerated sighs and checking his watch dramatically. When the woman finally stepped aside to wait for her order, Marcus approached the counter with the authoritative stride he had perfected over the years. The young barista, recognizing him as a regular customer and noting his rank, immediately straightened up and smiled nervously. "Good morning, Sergeant Thompson." "The usual today?" the barista asked, already reaching for a large cup. "That's right, son. Black coffee, extra shot," Marcus replied, his voice carrying just enough authority to remind everyone within earshot of his position. He noticed the woman glancing in his direction, and, for some reason, this annoyed him further. Civilians, he thought, always staring at real soldiers like they were some kind of curiosity. As Marcus waited for his coffee, he found himself standing next to the woman at the pickup counter. She was checking her phone, completely absorbed in what appeared to be work emails. Marcus couldn't help but notice that she seemed entirely unimpressed by his presence, which was unusual. Most people, especially civilians, showed some level of deference when they encountered military personnel. The barista handed Marcus his coffee first, despite the woman having ordered before him. This was the kind of respect Marcus expected, but he noticed the woman raised an eyebrow slightly at the obvious preferential treatment. Something about her reaction rubbed him the wrong way. Perhaps it was her lack of acknowledgement of his rank, or maybe it was the way she seemed to find the situation amusing rather than appropriate. Unable to resist making a point about military hierarchy and civilian ignorance, Marcus decided to engage her in conversation. He had done this before with other civilians who seemed to lack proper respect for the military structure. Usually, a brief explanation of his rank and responsibilities was enough to put people in their place and earn the deference he deserved. "First time seeing real military rank up close?" Marcus asked with a smirk, gesturing to the stripes on his sleeve. His tone was condescending, the kind reserved for those he considered beneath his station. "These 3 stripes mean something around here. Sergeant, United States Army. Been earning my way up the ladder for 8 years now." The woman looked up from her phone, studying Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. There was no intimidation in her eyes, no awe at his rank, just a quiet assessment that made Marcus slightly uncomfortable. Still, he pressed on, convinced that she simply didn't understand the significance of what she was seeing. "Most civilians don't realize the responsibility that comes with rank like this," Marcus continued, puffing out his chest slightly. "I've got men under my command, important decisions to make every day. It's not something everyone can handle." takes a special kind of person to earn these stripes." The woman remained silent, but Marcus caught what he thought was the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. This only encouraged him to continue his impromptu lecture about military hierarchy and the respect it commanded. He began explaining the difference between enlisted ranks and officers, how he had worked his way up from private, and the various responsibilities that came with his current position. "You see, in the military, rank means everything," Marcus explained, warming to his subject. "It's not like the civilian world where everyone thinks they're equal. We have structure, discipline, a clear chain of command. When someone with my rank speaks, people listen. When I give an order, it gets followed. That's how we maintain order and effectiveness." The woman continued to listen without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of acknowledgement. Marcus interpreted this as fascination with his knowledge and experience, not realizing that her silence might indicate something entirely different. He was so caught up in his own narrative that he failed to notice the subtle signs that might have warned a more observant person to proceed with caution. As his coffee grew cold in his hand, Marcus found himself sharing more personal anecdotes about his military career. He told stories about training exercises where his leadership had made the difference between success and failure. He described situations where his quick thinking and authority had resolved conflicts among his subordinates. Each story was carefully crafted to highlight his importance and competence, designed to impress this civilian audience of one. The woman's coffee had been ready for several minutes, but she made no move to leave. Marcus took this as evidence that she was genuinely interested in learning about military life from someone with real experience. He had encountered this before with civilians who were curious about the military but had never served themselves. Usually, these conversations ended with expressions of gratitude for his service and newfound respect for the sacrifices made by military personnel. "The thing most people don't understand," Marcus continued, leaning against the counter in a casual but authoritative pose, "is that earning rank like this isn't just about time served. It's about proving yourself under pressure, showing that you can handle responsibility, that other soldiers can count on you. Not everyone has what it takes to wear these stripes." As he spoke, Marcus noticed that the woman seemed to be paying particular attention to his description of military hierarchy and the importance of rank structure. This encouraged him to delve deeper into the subject, explaining the various levels of command and how respect flowed upward and downward through the chain. He was particularly proud of his knowledge of military protocol and enjoyed demonstrating his expertise to someone who clearly knew little about such matters. The morning rush was beginning to thin out, and the cafe was becoming quieter. This gave Marcus an even better platform for his impromptu military education session. He found himself getting more animated as he described various aspects of Army life, from basic training to deployment experiences. The woman listened attentively, occasionally asking brief questions that showed she was following his explanations. What Marcus didn't realize was that with each passing minute, he was digging himself deeper into a hole that would soon become impossible to climb out of. His assumptions about this quiet woman in civilian clothes were about to be challenged in a way that would forever change his perspective on respect, authority, and the dangerous game of underestimating others based on their appearance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would humble Marcus Thompson in ways he never could have imagined, teaching him that true authority doesn't always announce itself with stripes and decorations, and that sometimes the most powerful people in any room are the ones who choose to remain quiet and observe rather than boast about their accomplishments. As Marcus continued his lecture about military hierarchy, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break over his head, the woman across from him maintained her composed silence, waiting for just the right moment to reveal a truth that would shatter every assumption he had made about her identity and status. The next few minutes would prove to be the most educational of Sergeant Thompson's entire military career, though not in any way he could have anticipated or prepared for. As Marcus continued his explanation of military structure, he began to feel increasingly confident about the impression he was making. The woman seemed genuinely interested in his stories, and her questions, though brief, showed she was paying attention to the details of military life. This encouraged Marcus to share even more personal anecdotes about his rise through the ranks and the challenges he had overcome along the way. "You know," Marcus said, taking a sip of his now lukewarm coffee, "most people think military life is all about following orders and marching in formation. But when you reach a rank like mine, it's really about leadership and making tough decisions. The men under my command look to me for guidance, and I have to be ready to provide it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The woman nodded thoughtfully, which Marcus interpreted as admiration for his dedication and responsibility. He failed to notice that her expressions were becoming increasingly unreadable, or that she occasionally glanced at other patrons in the cafe who seemed to be watching their conversation with growing interest. Some of the other military personnel in the cafe had begun to pay attention to Marcus's loud discourse, though he was too absorbed in his own narrative to notice their reactions. The thing about rank, Marcus continued, is that it's not just about the stripes or the pay grade. It's about the respect that comes with proving yourself. When I walk onto a base, people know they're looking at someone who has earned his position through blood, sweat, and years of dedicated service. That's something you can't fake, and it's something civilians rarely understand. As Marcus spoke, he began to feel more comfortable with this impromptu audience. The woman's quiet attention made him believe she was genuinely learning something valuable about military culture from someone with real experience. This sense of being a teacher and mentor to someone outside the military hierarchy appealed to his ego and encouraged him to become even more expansive in his explanations. I remember when I first made sergeant, Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a treasured memory. The ceremony was small, but it meant everything to me. Finally, wearing these stripes, knowing that I had proven myself worthy of leading other soldiers. That's a feeling civilians never experience because they don't have the same structure, the same clear progression of authority and responsibility. The woman listened without interrupting, but Marcus began to notice that she occasionally checked her watch or glanced toward the door as if she might be expecting someone or had somewhere important to be. Rather than taking this as a hint that the conversation might be running long, Marcus interpreted it as evidence that she was impressed enough with his stories to want to continue listening despite other obligations. Feeling increasingly emboldened by what he perceived as his audience's fascination, Marcus decided to share what he considered one of his most amusing observations about military hierarchy and civilian ignorance. He had used this particular joke before with other service members, and it always got a good laugh because it played on the common military experience of dealing with civilians who had no understanding of military rank structure. "You want to know something funny?" Marcus said, leaning back against the counter with the casual confidence of someone about to deliver a punchline he knew would be well received. Most civilians, when they meet military personnel, they have no idea what they're looking at. They might know the difference between enlisted and officer, but that's about it. They certainly don't understand the nuances of rank structure or what different positions actually mean. The woman raised an eyebrow slightly, which Marcus took as encouragement to continue with his story. He was so focused on his own narrative that he completely missed the subtle shift in her expression, the way her posture straightened almost imperceptibly, or the fact that her attention seemed to sharpen rather than relax as he spoke. "I remember one time," Marcus continued, chuckling at the memory. "I was at a function with some civilian contractors, and they were trying to impress me by talking about military ranks they had heard of. One woman kept going on and on about how impressive it must be to meet a general, how much respect that would command, how few people ever reach that level of authority." Marcus paused for effect, enjoying the setup to his punchline. The woman across from him remained silent, but he noticed she seemed to be paying particularly close attention to this story. Other patrons in the cafe had also begun to listen, though Marcus was too caught up in his own narrative to analyze their expressions or body language. "So I started joking with her," Marcus continued, his grin widening as he approached the climax of his story. "I told her that meeting a general was no big deal, that they were just regular people when you got right down to it. I said that sure, they had more stars on their shoulders, but at the end of the day, they still put their pants on one leg at a time, just like everyone else." The woman's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes seemed to change. Marcus, however, was too focused on delivering his punchline to notice these subtle shifts in his audience's demeanor. He was building toward what he considered the funniest part of the story, the moment that always got the biggest laughs from his fellow soldiers. "Then, I really started having fun with it," Marcus said, his voice growing louder as his confidence increased. "I told her that generals, despite all their stars and ribbons, probably still struggled with basic things like programming their coffee makers or figuring out how to use new technology. I said that for all their authority and respect, they were probably just as confused by civilian life as civilians were by military protocol." Several other patrons in the cafe had now turned their attention to Marcus's animated storytelling. Some were military personnel who recognized him from the base, while others were civilians who seemed curious about the loud conversation taking place at the pickup counter. Marcus noticed the growing audience and felt even more energized, believing that his military insights were entertaining and educating a broader group of people. But here's the best part, Marcus said, preparing to deliver what he considered the ultimate punchline. I told this woman that she should never be intimidated by military rank, no matter how high it goes. I said that whether someone is a sergeant like me or even a 4-star general, they're still just people doing their jobs. I told her that rank is just a way of organizing responsibility, and that she shouldn't let all those stars and stripes impress her too much. Marcus laughed at his own story, remembering how funny it had seemed at the time and how much his fellow soldiers had enjoyed his irreverent take on military hierarchy. He looked at the woman expectantly, waiting for her to share in his amusement at the civilian contractor's awestruck reaction to military authority figures. Instead of laughing or even smiling, however, the woman simply looked at Marcus with an expression that was becoming increasingly difficult to read. There was something in her eyes that should have warned him to stop talking, something that suggested his story might not be landing the way he intended. But Marcus was too caught up in his own confidence and too convinced of his audience's engagement to recognize the warning signs. The point is, Marcus continued, oblivious to the growing tension in his audience, civilians get so impressed by military rank that they forget we're all just people. Whether it's my 3 stripes or some general's 4 stars, it's all just symbols of the jobs we do. No reason to be intimidated or overly impressed by any of it. As Marcus finished his story, he noticed that the cafe had grown unusually quiet. Conversations at other tables seemed to have stopped, and several people were staring in his direction with expressions that ranged from curiosity to what looked like barely contained amusement. The woman across from him remained silent, but there was definitely something different about her demeanor now, something that made Marcus suddenly and inexplicably nervous. You know, the woman said finally, her voice calm and steady but carrying an undertone that Marcus couldn't quite identify. That's a very interesting perspective on military hierarchy. You seem to have quite a bit of confidence in your understanding of how rank works and what different levels of authority actually mean. Something in her tone made Marcus pause. For the first time since the conversation began, he found himself actually looking at this woman instead of simply talking at her. There was something about the way she carried herself, something about the directness of her gaze, that suddenly made him question his assumptions about who he was talking to and whether his casual dismissal of higher military authority was as amusing as he had thought. But it was too late to take back his words or reconsider his approach. Marcus had committed himself to his position about military rank being no big deal, and his ego wouldn't allow him to back down now. He had painted himself into a corner with his own arrogance, and the woman across from him was about to show him just how costly that mistake would prove to be. The next few seconds would determine whether Marcus's confidence was justified or whether he had just made the biggest mistake of his military career. As the woman prepared to respond to his casual dismissal of high-ranking military authority, Marcus remained blissfully unaware that his entire worldview was about to be shattered by 3 simple words that would change everything he thought he knew about respect, rank, and the dangerous game of making assumptions about people based on their appearance. The silence that followed Marcus's dismissive comments about generals seemed to stretch longer than it should have. The woman across from him maintained her steady gaze, and for the first time in their entire conversation, Marcus began to feel genuinely uncomfortable. There was something in her expression that he couldn't quite identify, something that made his earlier confidence begin to waver despite his best efforts to maintain his authoritative demeanor. You really believe that rank doesn't matter much? The woman asked, her voice still calm, but with an edge that Marcus was finally beginning to notice. That whether someone has 3 stripes or 4 stars, it's all just symbols that don't deserve much respect or consideration? Marcus shifted his weight slightly, suddenly, aware that other patrons in the cafe were listening intently to their conversation. Some of the military personnel he recognized from base were watching with expressions that seemed to mix curiosity with something that looked almost like anticipation. It was as if they knew something he didn't, as if they were waiting for something to happen that Marcus couldn't see coming. Well, Marcus said, his voice not quite as steady as it had been moments before. Obviously, rank matters in terms of the chain of command and military structure. But what I'm saying is that it's not something civilians need to be intimidated by. We're all just people doing our jobs, regardless of how many stripes or stars we wear. The woman nodded slowly, as if she were carefully considering his words. That's an interesting philosophy, she said. Tell me, in your 8 years of service, have you had much opportunity to interact with general officers? To observe how they handle their responsibilities and the respect their rank commands? Something about the specificity of her question made Marcus pause. Most civilians didn't use terms like general officers or ask about interactions with high-ranking military personnel in such a knowledgeable way. For the first time, Marcus began to wonder if this woman might have more familiarity with military culture than he had initially assumed. Well, no, not directly, Marcus admitted reluctantly. At my level, we don't usually have much contact with officers that high up the chain. But the principles are the same regardless of rank. Authority is authority, whether it comes from a sergeant or a general. The woman's expression remained neutral, but Marcus caught what he was now certain was a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. This time, however, the smile didn't seem friendly or admiring. There was something else there, something that made Marcus's stomach begin to tighten with an anxiety he couldn't quite explain. The principles are the same, the woman repeated thoughtfully. That's one way to look at it, I suppose. Though I suspect someone with more experience at higher levels of command might have a different perspective on the complexities of military leadership and the respect that rank commands. Marcus felt a growing sense that this conversation was moving in a direction he hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. The woman's responses were becoming increasingly pointed, and her knowledge of military terminology was raising questions about her background that Marcus was now wishing he had asked earlier. But his pride wouldn't let him back down from the position he had taken, even as warning bells began to sound in the back of his mind. Look, Marcus said, trying to regain control of the conversation. I've been in the military for 8 years. I understand how the system works. Rank is important for organization and discipline, but at the end of the day, we're all serving the same cause. Whether someone is an enlisted soldier or a high-ranking officer, we're all part of the same team. The same team, the woman mused. That's true, in a sense. Though I imagine the responsibilities and perspectives can be quite different depending on your position within that team structure. As she spoke, Marcus noticed that the woman's posture had changed subtly. She was standing straighter now, and there was something in her bearing that commanded attention in a way he hadn't noticed before. It was the kind of presence that Marcus associated with command authority, the way senior officers carried themselves when they entered a room and expected immediate respect and attention. But that was impossible, Marcus told himself. This woman was clearly a civilian, dressed in ordinary clothes and displaying none of the obvious markers of military service. She had no uniform, no visible rank insignia, no indication that she had ever served in any branch of the military. Marcus was allowing his imagination to run away with him, seeing authority where none existed simply because he was feeling uncomfortable about the direction of their conversation. You mentioned earlier that you have men under your command, the woman continued. How many soldiers report to you directly, Sergeant Thompson? The use of his name caught Marcus off guard. He didn't remember telling her his name, though he supposed she might have overheard it when the barista addressed him earlier. Still, something about the way she said it, with a formal precision that reminded him of official military communications, made him feel even more unsettled. I have a squad of 12 soldiers, Marcus replied, his voice beginning to sound less confident than it had at the start of their conversation. They look to me for leadership and guidance in all aspects of their military service. 12 soldiers, the woman repeated. That's a significant responsibility. I'm sure you take that duty seriously and work hard to ensure they receive proper training and leadership. There was nothing obviously wrong with her response, but something about her tone suggested she was evaluating his answer rather than simply acknowledging it. Marcus felt as if he were being assessed in a way that made him uncomfortable, as if this supposed civilian had some basis for judging his military competence and leadership abilities. Of course I take it seriously, Marcus said, defensive now despite his best efforts to maintain his earlier confidence. Leading soldiers is the most important responsibility any non-commissioned officer can have. Every decision I make affects the lives and careers of the men under my command. Absolutely, the woman agreed. And I'm sure you expect those 12 soldiers to show you the proper respect due to your rank and position when you interact with them. Marcus nodded, unsure where this line of questioning was leading but growing increasingly certain that it was not heading anywhere good for him. The woman's questions were becoming more pointed, and her manner more formal, in ways that suggested she had specific knowledge about military protocol and leadership responsibilities. Of course they show proper respect, Marcus said. That's how the military works. Respect for rank and authority maintains discipline and order. My soldiers know that when I speak, they need to listen and follow orders without question. Without question, the woman repeated, and this time her slight smile was unmistakable. That's an interesting standard to set for your soldiers, Sergeant Thompson. I wonder if you apply that same principle consistently in your own interactions with military authority. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of her words began to sink in. There was no longer any doubt that this woman knew more about military structure than any civilian should. Her questions were too specific, her knowledge too detailed, and her manner too authoritative for someone without significant military experience. I'm sorry, Marcus said, his voice now noticeably shaky, but I don't think you ever mentioned your background. Are you military yourself, or do you work with the armed forces in some capacity? The woman looked at him for a long moment before responding, and, in that silence, Marcus became acutely aware of the complete attention their conversation was now receiving from everyone in the cafe. Military personnel and civilians alike were watching with expressions that ranged from fascination to barely concealed anticipation, as if they were all waiting for a moment that Marcus was only now beginning to sense was coming. You could say I work with the armed forces, the woman replied, her tone now carrying an unmistakable note of authority that made Marcus's heart begin to pound. I've been serving my country for quite some time now, actually. Much longer than your 8 years, in fact. Marcus swallowed hard, realizing that he had made a terrible mistake in his assumptions about this woman's identity and background. Whatever was about to happen, he was completely unprepared for it, and his earlier confidence had evaporated entirely. He had walked into a trap of his own making, and there was no way to escape the consequences of his arrogant dismissal of high-ranking military authority. In what capacity? Marcus managed to ask, though he was no longer certain he wanted to hear the answer. The woman straightened to her full height, and, suddenly, everything about her seemed different. Her casual demeanor was replaced by the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of decades of military service and the absolute confidence of someone who had earned the right to expect immediate respect and obedience from every person in uniform. I serve as a 4-star general in the United States Army, she said clearly and calmly, her words cutting through the silence of the cafe like a blade. And I've been listening with great interest to your thoughts on military hierarchy and the respect that rank deserves. The world seemed to stop completely as those words sank in. Marcus felt as if the ground had opened beneath his feet, as if everything he thought he knew about this conversation and this woman had just been revealed as completely wrong. The casual civilian he had been lecturing about military protocol for the past 20 minutes was actually one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire United States Army, someone whose authority extended over thousands of soldiers, and whose position demanded the kind of respect that Marcus had just spent 20 minutes dismissing as unnecessary and overrated. The silence that followed her revelation was deafening. Every person in the cafe was staring at Marcus, waiting to see how he would respond to the discovery that he had just spent 20 minutes condescendingly explaining military hierarchy to someone who outranked him by so many levels that there was no clear way to calculate the difference. His earlier confidence had been replaced by a horror so complete that he couldn't even begin to formulate a response. Marcus's military career, his reputation, and his understanding of his own place in the world had just been shattered by 3 simple words: 4-star general. Everything that followed would be an attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his own arrogance. But, deep down, he already knew that some mistakes are too big to overcome, and some lessons are too harsh to forget. The words 4-star general seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the cafe, bouncing off the walls and settling into Marcus's consciousness like physical blows. For several seconds that felt like hours, he simply stood frozen, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, his mind struggling to process the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about his situation. General Patricia Morrison watched Marcus's face cycle through disbelief, recognition, and growing horror as the full implications of his mistake began to dawn on him. She had been through similar moments before during her 30-year military career, though usually not in coffee shops, and rarely with such dramatic effect. There was something almost educational about watching a soldier confront the consequences of his own assumptions and arrogance in real time. Around them, the cafe had become completely silent except for the soft hum of coffee machines and the occasional whispered comment from other patrons who were witnessing what would undoubtedly become legendary among military personnel in the area. Several soldiers Marcus recognized from base were staring at him with expressions that mixed sympathy with fascination, clearly understanding the magnitude of his error and wondering how he would attempt to recover from it. "Sergeant Thompson," General Morrison said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her authority, "I believe you were explaining to me how rank is just a symbol and that civilians shouldn't be too impressed by military authority figures. Please, continue with your lesson on military hierarchy. I'm finding it quite enlightening." Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat felt as if it had closed completely, and his hands were beginning to shake as the adrenaline of pure terror flooded his system. Every instinct he had developed over 8 years of military service was screaming at him to snap to attention, render proper military courtesy, and somehow attempt to salvage the situation. But his body seemed incapable of responding to these mental commands. "I, General ma'am," Marcus stammered, finally finding his voice but not his words. The formal military address felt foreign and inadequate after 20 minutes of casual conversation, like trying to build a bridge over a canyon with toothpicks. Nothing he could say would undo the casual disrespect he had shown to one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. "You were telling me about your squad of 12 soldiers," General Morrison continued, her tone remaining calm, but carrying an undertone that made every military person within earshot straighten unconsciously. "And how they show you proper respect because they understand military hierarchy. I'm curious about how you demonstrate that same respect when interacting with your own superiors." Marcus felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Every word the general spoke was a reminder of his earlier comments about rank being no big deal and his dismissive attitude toward high-ranking officers. He had painted himself into a corner so completely that there was no possible way to escape without acknowledging the massive scope of his error. "Ma'am, I didn't realize," Marcus began, but General Morrison raised a hand slightly, a gesture so subtle that most civilians would have missed it, but which caused Marcus to stop speaking immediately. It was the kind of command presence that came from decades of leadership at the highest levels, the ability to control a situation with the smallest possible effort. "You didn't realize what, exactly, Sergeant Thompson?" she asked. "That someone who doesn't fit your expectations of what a general should look like might actually be one? That a woman in civilian clothes couldn't possibly have earned 4 stars? Or that your assumptions about people based on their appearance might sometimes be completely wrong?" Each question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He began to understand that this was not just about his mistake in failing to recognize a high-ranking officer, but about the broader implications of his attitude toward authority, respect, and his own place in the military hierarchy. General Morrison was using this moment as a teaching opportunity, though Marcus suspected he was not going to enjoy the lesson. "No, ma'am, that's not. I didn't intend." Marcus struggled to find words that might somehow minimize his error, but everything he tried to say only seemed to make the situation worse. There was no explanation that could justify his behavior, no excuse that could make his casual dismissal of military authority seem appropriate or understandable. "Let me ask you something, Sergeant," General Morrison said, stepping slightly closer to Marcus in a way that made her authority even more obvious. "When your soldiers fail to show proper respect to you, how do you handle that situation? What consequences do they face for dismissing your authority or making jokes about your rank?" Marcus swallowed hard, understanding exactly where this line of questioning was leading. "They face disciplinary action, ma'am. Depending on the severity of the disrespect, it could range from additional duty to formal counseling to reduction in rank." "Interesting," the general replied. "So you believe that respect for military authority is important enough to enforce with disciplinary action when you're the one being disrespected. But when you're talking about higher-ranking officers, suddenly, rank becomes just symbols that people shouldn't be too impressed by." The hypocrisy of his position was now fully exposed, and Marcus realized that any attempt to defend or explain his earlier comments would only make things worse. He had been caught in a contradiction so fundamental that it revealed something troubling about his character and his understanding of military values. The general wasn't just correcting a mistake. She was exposing a flaw in his thinking that went to the heart of what it meant to be a professional soldier. "Ma'am, I was completely wrong in what I said," Marcus finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I showed disrespect to you and to your rank, and I have no excuse for my behavior." I violated everything I've been taught about military courtesy and respect for authority. General Morrison nodded slightly, acknowledging his admission without indicating whether she considered it adequate. The silence stretched between them as Marcus waited to learn what consequences would follow his unprecedented breach of military protocol. Around them, the entire cafe remained frozen in anticipation, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "Tell me about your soldiers again, Sergeant Thompson," the general said finally. "The 12 people who look to you for leadership and guidance. What example do you think you've set for them today? What lesson have you taught them about respect for authority and military values?" Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that his error was about more than just his own career and reputation. As a leader of soldiers, his behavior reflected on the military as a whole and set an example for the men under his command. If word of this incident got back to his squad, which it inevitably would, what would they think about his lectures on respect and military courtesy? "Ma'am, I've set a terrible example," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of his realization. "I've shown them that the values I preach don't apply when I think no one is watching, that I'm willing to mock and dismiss the very authority structure I claim to represent. I've demonstrated that my respect for rank is conditional and self-serving." "That's a remarkably honest assessment," General Morrison replied. "Now, what do you think should happen next? If one of your soldiers had behaved the way you just did, showing such casual disrespect for military authority while in uniform and in public, how would you handle the situation?" Marcus knew there was no good answer to this question. Military justice was designed to be consistent and impartial, which meant that his behavior deserved the same consequences that would face any soldier who publicly disrespected a superior officer. The fact that his disrespect had been directed at a 4-star general made the situation infinitely worse, placing it in a category of military infractions that could end careers and result in serious legal consequences. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, "a soldier who behaved as I have would face serious disciplinary action, possibly including reduction in rank, loss of leadership position, and formal charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The severity of disrespecting a general officer would warrant the most serious possible consequences." General Morrison remained silent for a long moment, allowing Marcus to fully comprehend the implications of his own words. He had effectively outlined the potential destruction of his military career, acknowledged that his behavior warranted severe punishment, and demonstrated that he understood the gravity of his mistake. The question now was whether understanding would be enough to mitigate the consequences of his actions. The cafe around them remained suspended in silence, everyone waiting to see how this extraordinary confrontation would conclude. Marcus stood at attention now, though no one had ordered him to do so, his military training finally overriding his shock and embarrassment. Whatever happened next would determine not just the immediate consequences of his mistake, but the entire future direction of his military career. General Morrison looked at Marcus for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her words would determine whether this incident would be remembered as the end of Sergeant Thompson's military service or as the most important learning experience of his career. The choice was hers alone, and Marcus could only wait to discover whether his honesty and acknowledgement of error would earn him a chance at redemption or simply serve as the final entry in his military personnel file. General Morrison studied Marcus for what felt like an eternity, her experienced eyes taking in everything from his rigid posture to the genuine remorse written across his face. Throughout her 3 decades of military service, she had encountered countless soldiers who made mistakes, showed poor judgment, or displayed attitudes that needed correction. What mattered most in such situations was not the mistake itself, but how the individual responded when confronted with their error and what they demonstrated about their capacity for growth and learning. "At ease, Sergeant Thompson," she said finally, and Marcus visibly relaxed though his expression remained deeply troubled. "I want you to understand something important. This conversation we just had, it wasn't an accident. I knew exactly who you were before you started talking, and I was very deliberately giving you enough rope to either pull yourself up or hang yourself with. The choice of which one happened was entirely yours." Marcus felt a mixture of confusion and growing dread as he processed her words. "Ma'am, I don't understand. You knew who I was." "Sergeant, I've been reviewing personnel files for potential candidates for a new leadership development program. Your name was on my desk yesterday, recommended by your company commander for advanced training opportunities. I wanted to see what kind of soldier Marcus Thompson really was when he thought no one important was watching. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Not only had he disrespected a four-star general, but he had done so while potentially being evaluated for career advancement opportunities. His casual arrogance and dismissive attitude toward military hierarchy had been displayed in front of the one person whose opinion could most dramatically impact his future prospects in the military. I wanted to see if you were the kind of leader who practices what he preaches, General Morrison continued. Whether your respect for military values was genuine or just something you performed when it was convenient. I'm afraid you've answered that question quite clearly. Marcus felt the weight of lost opportunities crushing down on him. Any chance for advancement, for special training, for the kind of career progression he had dreamed about, had just evaporated because of 20 minutes of casual arrogance. His own words and attitudes had destroyed possibilities he hadn't even known existed. However, the general continued, and something in her tone made Marcus look up with the faintest glimmer of hope. What happened after I revealed my rank was almost as instructive as what happened before. You didn't try to make excuses, didn't attempt to justify your behavior, and didn't blame anyone else for your mistake. You took full responsibility and demonstrated that you understood exactly why your behavior was unacceptable. Marcus remained silent, unsure whether this observation was leading somewhere positive or simply adding to his condemnation. General Morrison walked slowly around him, her movements casual, but her attention focused entirely on his reactions and responses. Tell me something, Sergeant Thompson. Why do you think military hierarchy exists? Not the textbook answer you might give to a civilian, but the real reason why rank structure matters in military organizations. Marcus thought carefully before responding, understanding that this question was another test, another opportunity to demonstrate whether he had learned anything from this devastating experience. Ma'am, hierarchy exists because military operations require instant, unquestioned obedience to achieve mission success and protect lives. When bullets are flying, there's no time for debate or discussion. Soldiers need to know that orders will be followed immediately and completely. That's part of it, General Morrison agreed. But there's something deeper. Military hierarchy exists because it embodies the values and traditions that make us effective as a fighting force. Respect for rank isn't just about organizational efficiency. It's about demonstrating commitment to something larger than yourself. When you show proper respect to a superior officer, you're acknowledging that our entire system of military service depends on each person fulfilling their role with integrity and dedication. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand that his casual dismissal of high-ranking officers wasn't just disrespectful to individuals, but was an attack on the fundamental values that held the military together as an institution. His attitude had revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to be a professional soldier. The question now, General Morrison said, stopping directly in front of Marcus, is whether this experience has taught you something valuable about leadership, respect, and military values, or whether you're simply embarrassed about getting caught. The difference between those two responses will determine what kind of soldier you become from this point forward. Ma'am, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. This experience has shown me that I had a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service really means. I thought respect for authority was something I could choose to display when it was convenient or when I thought it mattered. I realize now that military values aren't situational. They're either part of who you are or they're not. Today, I discovered they weren't really part of who I was, and that's something I need to change if I want to continue serving. General Morrison studied his expression carefully, looking for signs of sincerity versus mere performance. What she saw seemed to satisfy her, because her stern expression softened slightly, though her authority remained unmistakable. Here's what's going to happen, Sergeant Thompson. You're going to return to your unit and continue performing your duties exactly as you have been. But you're also going to begin a personal development program that I'm designing specifically for you. Once a month, for the next 12 months, you'll report to my office for a conversation about leadership, military values, and what it means to be a professional soldier. Marcus felt a surge of emotions that ranged from relief to gratitude to renewed determination. Rather than destroying his career, General Morrison was offering him a chance to rebuild himself as a better soldier and leader. It was an opportunity he had never expected, and one he knew he had to earn through consistent demonstration of genuine change. Additionally, the general continued, you'll be responsible for developing and presenting a training program for your squad on military courtesy and respect for authority. I want you to use your own experience as a case study in how assumptions and arrogance can undermine military effectiveness. You'll teach them what you learned today, and in doing so, you'll reinforce those lessons for yourself. The idea of sharing his humiliation with his soldiers was deeply uncomfortable, but Marcus understood the wisdom behind the assignment. Teaching others about his mistake would force him to confront and understand his error more completely than any punishment could accomplish. It would also demonstrate to his soldiers that even their leaders were capable of making serious mistakes and learning from them. "Ma'am, I accept these responsibilities gratefully," Marcus said. "I understand that you're giving me an opportunity one don't deserve, and I won't waste it. I'll prove to you and to myself that I can become the kind of leader who truly embodies military values." General Morrison nodded approvingly. "I believe you will, Sergeant Thompson. Today you learned that true authority doesn't need to announce itself, that respect is something you demonstrate consistently rather than selectively, and that leadership is about setting an example even when you think no one is watching. Those are valuable lessons that will serve you well if you take them seriously." As she prepared to leave, General Morrison turned back to Marcus one final time. "One more thing, Sergeant. I want you to remember that today could have ended very differently. Another general might have filed formal charges, recommended your removal from leadership positions, or ended your military career entirely. I'm choosing to invest in your potential for growth instead of focusing on your current shortcomings. Don't make me regret that choice." "You won't, ma'am," Marcus replied with absolute conviction. "I give you my word as a soldier that I'll earn your confidence and become worthy of the opportunity you're giving me." General Morrison picked up her coffee and walked toward the door, leaving Marcus standing alone at the counter with the weight of his mistake and the hope of redemption both settling into his consciousness. Around him, the cafe slowly returned to normal activity, though he noticed that several military personnel nodded respectfully in his direction as they left, perhaps recognizing that he had been given a rare second chance. As Marcus finally left the cafe that morning, he carried with him a completely transformed understanding of military service, leadership, and his own place in the complex hierarchy of the armed forces. The encounter had stripped away his arrogance and casual disrespect, replacing them with genuine humility and a renewed commitment to the values he had claimed to represent but had never truly embraced. 12 months later, Marcus would complete his mentorship program with General Morrison, having demonstrated through consistent behavior and dedicated service that his transformation was genuine and lasting. His squad would become known throughout the base for their exceptional military courtesy and respect for authority, a reflection of the lessons their sergeant had learned and shared from his own moment of reckoning in a simple coffee shop. The story of Sergeant Thompson's encounter with General Morrison would become legendary among military personnel, told and retold as an example of how assumptions can be dangerous, how respect must be consistent, and how true leadership sometimes means acknowledging your mistakes and learning from them rather than trying to hide or excuse them. For Marcus himself, the incident would remain the most important 20 minutes of his military career, the moment when he stopped performing the role of a soldier and began truly becoming one. It was a lesson in humility that transformed not just his behavior, but his character, teaching him that genuine authority comes from integrity and consistent values rather than from rank alone. The coffee shop encounter had begun with Marcus's casual arrogance and ended with his profound humility, demonstrating that sometimes the most valuable education comes from the most unexpected sources and that true leadership requires the courage to confront your own shortcomings and commit to becoming better. In learning to respect the authority of others, Marcus had finally earned the right to exercise authority himself, not as a privilege to be flaunted, but as a responsibility to be honored through consistent demonstration of military values and genuine care for those under his command.